So it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this wonderful session titled Ethics of AI. So my name is Park Kyung-yeol, Kyung Park. I'm your moderator today. I'm housed in the Graduate School of Science and Technology Policy in KAIST. So in this session, we particularly focus on the ethical consideration and ethical implications of AI. There has been a rapid technological innovation these days. We have tremendous opportunities in industry and academia and business, but at the same time, we have many issues and problems from the socio-political context as well. So in this year, we have been preparing this session within this kind of context and discuss coexistence in the era of AI. So that actually lays a foundation for today's discussion about AI ethics from different perspectives. So for my curiosity, I asked the ChatGPT for a definition of AI ethics just today. It responded, the moral principles and guidelines that govern the development, deployment, and use of AI systems to ensure they are fair, transparent, accountable, and aligned with human values and societal well-being. Does it make sense to you, right? Or is there any missing part? So as we all know, the generative AI actually are trained on the massive data, especially unstructured text data, generated by the human agency as well as non-human agencies. So this means the answers are always shaped by data, reflecting the existing biases and socioeconomic values. So some important questions arise here. Who is responsible? And who holds ethical and legal accountability for the decisions and potential consequences of AI-generated content? And what mechanisms and safeguards can be implemented within GenAI models to ensure fairness and minimize inherent biases in their inputs? And in what ways can AI systems be designed and regulated to uphold the fundamental human rights? So in order to answer these questions and to share insights, so I'm really excited to have tremendous speakers today, and actually who needs very little introduction. So they all have extensive experiences in research and then AI ethics and AI governance, and also make tremendous contribution to the business process and also policy shaping process as well. So first of all, right next to me, Professor Stuart Russell from UC Berkeley, and Head of Public Policy and Government Relations at Uber, Mike Orgill, Professor Matthew Liao from NYU, and Justine Gauthier, Head of AI Governance from Mela. So maybe from Mike, so you've been working in the Uber and Airbnb in different markets, different countries, in advanced country and also emerging markets. Based on your experiences, what is the most significant challenge in AI ethics and in your field and also in your project and program and your industry? Would you like to share?
It's a big question, and it's such a tough act to follow. It didn't feel like the warm-up act that you promised. It felt kind of like the main event there. But one of the things that struck me in what Stuart was talking about was just how important of a choice we have to make around this point about whether we want safe AI or if we want no AI. And the importance of making the right decisions at the right times as we look at the adoption of new technology. Kyung, as you said, I've fortunately been able to work in a number of different countries across a bunch of different emerging technologies. And as those technologies intersect with society, one thing is pretty much always a given, is that the pace of regulation is behind the adoption of the technology. And so it's really important to, one, for those that are adopting the technology to be smart and to think through the governance of that technology. And then second is to work with policymakers and regulators to get the right kinds of frameworks in place. When those two things do not happen, that's when you start to see adverse situations where technology can be applied inappropriately or individuals might use it for more nefarious purposes. And so from our perspective at a company like Uber, when we think about AI, we've had to put in place a whole governance structure around how do we use AI, where is it deployed, and how do we make sure that it has the right oversight so that the human-centric goals that we have are most are really achieved. Because otherwise, you start to get the AI to drive where you're going, and you kind of lose control of it. Mm-hmm. So as I look forward, I'd say the big thing for us in Korea, in the region, or more broadly, is to really be deliberate about the choices that we're making, so that we have the right control to prevent those sort of adverse outcomes.
Right. Thank you. And Matthew, as a philosopher, I was just curious about your own kind of definition of AI ethics, and then maybe given that you also published that renowned book, Ethics of Artificial Intelligence, and what for you? I mean, what is the kind of biggest and challenge in the field of AI ethics?
Great, thank you. Is this on? In the field of AI ethics, you can kind of distinguish between near-term AI ethical issues, like ethical issues surrounding AI. So things like bias, things like deepfakes, facial recognitions, and so on and so forth, copyrights, which I think Justine will talk about. And then the more longer-term issues surrounding AI. What happens when robots become smarter than we are? These are the issues that Stuart was talking about. And I just, want to comment a bit on Stuart's really excellent presentation. I think he's posing a really serious and important question. Right. So, is it possible for AIs to become smarter than we are? What happens when they're smarter than we are? Like, can we do anything about it? Are we just going to go extinct? Stuart's own solution, he thinks that we need to have these provable AIs or no AIs at all. I have some doubts about the provable AIs myself because, as a philosopher, there are a couple of reasons. So one is that if you can actually prove, if you can actually really understand this AI system, it's very hard to think that this thing could be more intelligent than we are, right? I mean, we even have problems understanding other human intelligence. Like, that's a big field. Like, how is it that human beings are smart? And now you're trying to imagine an AI, like another entity that's going to be smarter than we are. But at the same time, it's got to satisfy the requirement that we can understand exactly what's going on with this entity. I just, I don't think that we'll be able to do that. I could be wrong. I mean, that's an empirical question, but so that's sort of one thing I have, one concern I have. The other thing is Stuart is talking about in philosophy called a desire satisfaction, preference satisfaction account. It's based on some sort of utilitarianism. And, he already identified a bunch of worries about that particular account, namely whose desires should be satisfying, right? A lot of people are racist, they're misogynistic. We don't want to be satisfying those desires. He raised the question of, well, what happens if we don't do that, then we kind of have some sort of paternalism, right? But I don't think that has to happen. So already he mentioned Amartya Sen. So Amartya Sen talks about human rights, for example. So you might think, you can take a different approach. Imagine you got an AI that can respect human rights, right? Whatever that may be. And respecting human rights it's not the same thing as respecting their preferences. It requires respecting their autonomy, right? If they want to do certain things, you shouldn't sort of interfere with their autonomy. But it doesn't mean that you respect every single one of their preferences, even the bad ones, right? And so that could be maybe that's an alternative approach. I have, and I'll just say one other thing and I'll stop. I think there are a couple other solutions that other people have put on the table. One is this idea that if you can't fight them, join them, right? So this is the idea that maybe we need to upgrade ourselves, right? So now that AIs are getting smarter, maybe we can use something like brain-computer interface. Maybe we need to think about looking for psychopharmaceutical, enhancements and so on and so forth. So, that's one way, that could be another thing that we could explore. Maybe that has its limits. And then the other one is, of course, to, whatever we do, make sure that we create entities that can respect our moral standing as human beings. So,
very nice. I think in order to discuss about the human right approach for AI, it's very interesting to witness that there was United Nations resolutions on AI. So I think so. Let me just come back to that kind of proliferation of the AI regulation, and maybe for the next discussion. So Justine has a really great, unique, background, and then you have, legal background and also policy, and then industry background and research as well. So would you like to just, continue our discussion on the AI ethics and challenges?
Yeah, of course. I mean, just in terms of challenges, because that's kind of what you guys were talking about, I think I'm going to echo a point that Mike made, and that was also made in Professor Russell's presentation. And I think a big challenge right now is interdisciplinarity. And that's true actually on the AI ethics and AI governance side, but also on the tech and science side as well, right? We talked about in the previous session AI for science, and this is an area that at its core requires interdisciplinarity between people of different expertise, and that's not always easy to achieve. And on the AI governance side, interdisciplinarity is a challenge both at the broader policy level and then at the organizational or more applied level. So at the broader policy level, having government, private sector, academia, civil society, having all of those people included in discussions and decisions around AI policy is key, but that's really a challenge for a number of different reasons, and just the way that the way that these decisions are made. And if you go even broader than that, on the kind of ethical discussions, Professor Russell mentioned in his speech, bringing different people together, economists, AI researchers, ethicists, and philosophers are trying to work together to work out those issues and to figure out, what is a perfect version of the AI world. And I think I was in one of those groups back in San Francisco a few months ago, and I can attest the fact that it was very hard as a group to come up with the perfect solution. But then for organizations, at the organizational level, when we're looking at putting, AI governance frameworks together and putting policies and making sure that we're adopting AI responsibly, interdisciplinarity is also a challenge. I mean, there's a communication and collaboration challenge between all the different people in an organization that are sitting together at that table talking about ethics, talking about, responsible AI. And we need those different types of people sitting at that table, because it can't just be the machine learning researchers talking about ethics and responsible AI, and it can't also just be the people on this panel right now, right? We need those different types of points of view, and in organizations, I have seen that that's actually quite tricky. When we look at different layers of AI governance frameworks, like we have, the kind of environmental context layers. So we may have a team in an organization that's looking at, okay, what's the regulation? We'll have a legal team looking at what's the regulation that applies, what's the regulations that is coming, are there standards that apply? And then you're going to have another level, and you're going to have maybe, responsible AI and AI governance folks working on kind of the AI governance framework of an organization and putting policies and processes together. And then you'll have another group beyond that working on the more technical aspects, the groups that are actually, the teams that are actually, running assessments and doing audit and monitoring and, working on preventing biases in systems. And it's not a bad thing to have different people working on all these different things. It's actually a good thing. But what often happens is that these people don't really talk to each other, right? And I think that's true also at the broader policy level.
Thank you, Justin. I think the interdisciplinarity is just a fantastic point of view. But if I may be a little bit provocative, are we really working together? I mean, I'm not just talking about the lack of collaboration between different stakeholders, but even within the government, there's a lot of fragmentation in terms of AI governance and AI policy, and even in academia, researcher, it's really, really hard to work together crossing the border. So is there any good idea for maximizing the potential for the multi or transdisciplinarity?
Yeah, these are great comments, and I think actually want to pick up on something that Matthew said about what is sometimes called short-term versus long-term issues in AI ethics. And often this is cast as that these are in conflict. And you often hear that the long-term issue is just a distraction, a deliberate attempt to distract from the short-term issues, which I find is sort of a puzzling argument because, Alan Turing did not have a lot of Google DeepMind stock, right? And he still thought about the long-term issue and thought that this was really serious. Some of the people who point to the long-term risk are the CEOs of the companies that are creating this risk. And there's a conspiracy theory explaining, well, they're doing that to boost their stock price. But interestingly, we don't see the CEOs of oil companies talking up the existential risk from carbon dioxide in order to raise their stock price. So this whole narrative, I think, is really corrosive and it's counterproductive because, in fact, it's a continuum. And the reasons why the short-term harms are there, you take discrimination, for example, is the same reason why the long-term harm is there. It's misalignment, right? We are designing AI systems that optimize the wrong objective. So why do we have discrimination? Because machine learning researchers are trained to optimize the fit of the model to the training data. That's what they think the objective is supposed to be because that's what their stat class or their machine learning class or even some textbook author told them they were supposed to do. But of course, if your data reflect a lot of bias from the society that you live in, then your algorithm is going to reflect that bias, and training the algorithm to fit the data is just the wrong objective because you care about fairness as well as about accuracy, but you forgot to put fairness in the objective, so you get misalignment. That's exactly the problem that Alan Turing was worried about. Misalignment, except in this case, it's misalignment not of an algorithm for giving away credit cards, but an algorithm that's more capable than the whole human race put together. But it's the same underlying problem, and we should be working together and sharing ideas and sharing solutions and sharing approaches. So that's one point I wanted to make on that. But interdisciplinarity, yeah, it's really tough. Regulation is really tough. As I mentioned, right, it's a battle at the moment between a couple of hundred people who are concerned about AI safety, a couple of hundred people who are concerned about bias, discrimination, and so on, and an industry that is deploying $15 trillion in capital and employs thousands of full-time lobbyists around the world to get their way. And their way for the last 50 years has been, there shall be no regulation of our industry. And they will say this with a straight face, in meetings like this, in meetings with heads of state, that there should be no regulation because, as we all know, regulation stifles innovation. They flew to that meeting on a highly regulated airplane. They are eating highly regulated food at this meeting. They are sitting in a highly regulated building that complies with building codes. They got their hair cut by a highly regulated hairdresser. But for some reason, they think that they should be protected by all these regulations, but no one should be protected from their technology. And this seems to me just a fundamental ethical failure in the way I think computer scientists are trained to think and the way we have allowed the industry to evolve.
Sure. I think this discussion also related to this kind of global proliferation of AI norms and regulations and frameworks. So you could, Mike, you could also mention about how we can actually work together. I mean, across the sectors and also different countries, maybe.
Well, I mean, your first provocative question of basically, do we have the right people in the room to address this is a really interesting one. It reminds me of when internet governance was a prominent topic in maybe the early 2010s.
Right.
And what you saw then was you saw that the forum for decision making and discussion was largely run by people that worked in the telecommunications industry. So they knew the telecommunications industry really, really well, but they didn't quite understand issues around freedom of expression, cross-border data flows, emerging technology issues. And what had to happen very, very quickly was people from the nonprofit sector, people who had that expertise had to get involved. And I think as the issue became more and more pressing, more and more people came to the table. And so I think one thing that at least gives me some amount of comfort is that more and more people are coming to the table on this particular issue to have those right kind of conversations. I think one challenge that I see is that the bigger conversations around the future of AI don't really get at some of those near-term challenges that you were addressing. So if we take a look at my industry, the mobility industry, we're using AI in any number of different spaces. We're using AI to look at safety outcomes, for example, which would all agree if you can use technology to make roads safer, you probably should. For example, we're able to look at the telematics in a phone to see if somebody is accelerating too much or they're braking too hard. We look at the time that they're online. We can look at the time of day, and we can start to think through how do we push nudges to drivers to be safer. We can all believe that those are good things to have, but if you want to have the right regulations in place, it's not going to happen from a Ministry of Technology who's setting broader long-term technology standards. It's going to come from the regulators who have to become very, very smart very, very quickly, who are used to thinking about supply and demand regulation, learning how to think about the ethical issues that might be involved. And so maybe to Matthew's point a little bit, we have to up-level ourselves a little bit to be able to address these issues. Because fundamentally, I believe that we can harness AI to improve outcomes for humans. One other interesting example is if we think about Uber's famous for its supply and demand matching. As we use AI to get even better and better at that supply and demand matching, where we can say there's a conference that happens to be getting out at 6 o'clock, and we're going to have an influx of people. Being able to price those things better to get better outcomes for customers and for drivers is probably a good thing. But certainly there are considerations on the other hand that we need to be thinking through. Regulators need to understand what those considerations are, and we have to partner to address them. And so, I think not everybody's at the table today, but it does feel like people are running at the table, which is good.
Matthew?
Yeah, so wanted to comment on Stuart's, something Stuart said. So I think Stuart's absolutely right that in the, debate on AI ethics, there are sort of people short-term versus long-term, and some people who are short-term say, we shouldn't talk about the long-term at all. It's such a waste of time, and so on and so forth. And I'm on Stuart's side that it's a continuum. I myself think that both sets of issues are very important. We should address them. We shouldn't just sort of think that one is more important, than the other. They're both important to address. I mean, there's one thing that I did want to comment on, which was, Stuart talks about how both sets of issues are, he understands them in terms of misalignment. I'm not sure if that's the best way to go. I find that to be a bit too broad, in terms of identifying the issues. The way I do it is I like to think, there are ethical issues that arise because AIs are not working very well, right? So take biases, for example. It's because our data sets are not complete. We don't have enough representation in there, and so we get bias, et cetera, et cetera. Distinguish those issues from cases where AIs are working too well and humans are vulnerable, right? Which is a very different set of issues. And so take like facial recognition technology, for example. That's a case where AI is working too well and we don't want to be subjected to all those type of surveillance and so on and so forth. Or another would be super AI, where when super intelligent AIs are working too well, that might be problems for us. So I would want to get into the weeds and sort of the nuances of like what exactly is going on. And then I want to just say one other thing, which is about governance. So Kyung knows that I've been working actually on the issue of AI and digital governance. And one of the papers that we've recently wrote is, we call it the 5W1H of digital, sort of AI governance. And the framework basically looks at, I think it's helpful to sort of break down the questions into what should be regulated. So are we talking about, is it just the data? Is it the algorithm? Is it based on risk? Is it based on sector? Why should we regulate? Is it for ethical reasons? Is it for nationalistic reasons? Is it for legal reasons? Who should be regulating, right? Should we just leave it to experts, right? Should it just be the government? Should it be the public, and so on and so forth? When should we regulate, right? Should it be upstream? Should it be downstream, right? Upstream is when the technology that's being developed. Downstream, or should be life cycle regulation. Where should the regulation take place? Is it sort of national borders, or is it global, or is it local, right? And then, and how should we be doing the regulation? So is it, do we do it through voluntary guidelines and so on and so forth, which are problematic because they're not very binding, or hard laws, which are great because they can kind of get us to do things, but they're very slow, right? And so those are, I think we need to think through some of these. A lot of people talk about governance and regulation, but they're just all sorts of different questions, and we really need to get clear on what we're talking about.
Right. Fantastic. Justine? Yeah.
Yeah, I can probably add to both of those points that you just made, Matthew, on regulation. And, I think that in regulation, in the what to regulate, there's also the question of, do we regulate use cases or applications, or do we regulate the capabilities? And, we talked about also the short-term versus long-term, and now we're talking kind of use cases versus capabilities. There's a lot of kind of dichotomies or false dichotomies in those discussions. And, from a legal perspective, there's also the question of harms that can be caused to individuals or groups of individuals versus harms that can affect, entire communities, or harms that can affect, our entire society. So from a legal background, for harms that are caused to individuals or to a group of individuals, not to say that we don't need regulation and we shouldn't be trying to prevent those. Of course we should, and this is what things like the EU AI Act is doing. But things like liability and tort law will apply and will evolve, and hopefully people can be held accountable when they fail to take the proper measures to prevent harms from happening to people in a more individual manner. But when it comes to the broader harms and some of those that Professor Russell was talking about, so when we're talking about harming our entire society, things like mass disinformation or biological weapons or loss of control, this is where our legal frameworks and liability will be of little help, because if one of those harms do occur, I mean, you can sue someone, it's not going to be of great comfort to any of us. I think it's also important to mention that there isn't consensus in the scientific community around, whether those risks are going to materialize or not, or at what speed they will. But regardless, we need to be thinking about regulation and international cooperation to prevent those major widespread risks from happening in the first place. And we are starting to see regulators interested in that topic as well. For example, in California with the proposed bill on frontier AI models. So, while liability regimes and kind of existing legal frameworks and regulation that's already being worked on can be an effective way to remedy more, individual harms, holding someone accountable after the fact for some of these more mass or catastrophic harms will be really hard, and it won't really get us the result that we want. So I think that, regulation and also work on, mathematical and technical capabilities on that front needs to continue to evolve.
From your legal background, how does copyright infringement, related to this AI ethics issue?
Yes. So AI brings a major paradigm shift to our notions of copyright and IP. And, again, it's not just a matter of updating our laws to add the word AI in them, right? Our copyright laws or our IP laws. And, not to belittle the impact that software had on our IP regimes, but when software came around, that was somewhat the case. Software was this new type of format, a new type of creation, and we needed to figure out, how and if we wanted to include that in our regimes around intellectual property and copyright. And what ended up happening there is that, software was included in an existing category in our IP regimes that we call literary works. So in the same way that a book can be copyrighted, so can a string of lines of code, right? But with AI, we're not talking about a new format or a new type of creation, although that may come as new modalities emerge, but we're talking about changing the very way that we create those works, and we're talking about changing who creates those creations and those works. So this is a much more complicated question. And right now, if you ask someone or any lawyer or any IP person, does AI infringe on copyright? The only possible answer is we don't know, because our laws are not updated. We don't know how to deal with this. Now, there's a number of lawsuits that are going on, and mainly in the United States. So the outcome of these lawsuits will, likely provide some answers on that. But, it's a huge question mark, and it's a huge issue for the companies that are developing these models. And, even the companies that are open sourcing their models, like Meta, they're not disclosing the training data. And we can speculate on the reasons for that, but one of the speculations that I may have is because of copyright violation, and another one could be privacy violations as well.
Great. I think we'd like to open up the floor and then for a couple of questions and comments. So if you have any questions and then comments, please just raise your hands. And gentleman over there.
AI라는 이 우리 세상의 모든 것에 전방위적으로 활용하게 될 이 AI에 관련해서 의문점은 AI가 어떻게 움직이는지 사실은 모른다. 블랙박스다. 그럴 때 그럼 책임은 누가 지게 하는 건지, 그 AI 프로그램을 만든 어떤 회사가 되는 건지, 그 AI를 쓴 개인 또는 회사가 되는 것인지 그게 좀 궁금합니다.
Fantastic questions. You guys already, listen to okay. So it's basically, the question about who should be responsible. So I think, I'll just, give a chance to.
Let Stuart, who's been working on this issue for
right. So
a few years longer than I have.
So
Mike, I'm happy to follow up on what he says.
So you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, Mike may have more up-to-date information than I, but my understanding is that under the agreements in California that allow Waymo and Cruise to operate fully autonomous vehicles in San Francisco, the companies have accepted strict liability. And their view is if the algorithm is driving the car and there's an accident, then if the car is determined to be at fault, that decision is made in exactly the same way it would be if there was a human driver, right? So if the autonomous car is rear-ended by a human who's drunk, then the autonomous car is not at fault. But in the cases where a human would be at fault, the car is at fault, the company accepts strict liability. I think that's the only way we can do this. And I also happen to be on the board of in fact, the biggest auto insurer in Canada. And we talk about this a fair amount, about how this is going to impact the auto insurance business. A number that you often hear is that we will accept fully autonomous vehicles on our roads when the accident rate is 10 times less. So they have to be 10 times safer than a human taxi driver. And human taxi drivers, in most cases, are much safer than the average driver because they are professionals and it's their livelihood and they practice a lot more than we do. So that's a very high standard. Many taxi drivers go an entire life, so they drive for 40 years without an accident, right? And so it's a very, very high standard indeed. If autonomous vehicles meet that standard, and if we move to largely autonomous vehicle fleets instead of human drivers, then the car insurance business is going to be dramatically changed. Rates will have to go down. Claims will be almost non-existent. So in some sense, it will actually extinguish the car insurance industry. So that's one of the things we talk about on the board. But I would say we're also not holding our breath. The problem of autonomous driving is much more difficult than people thought because, in fact, people are really good at driving. Right? In that 40-year career, that's about 400 million seconds of driving. And so if you make no serious mistakes in 400 million seconds, right, that's about almost 9 nines of reliability. And so it's really, really hard to have an AI system that achieves that level of reliability. And how would you show that it was that good? Right? It would have to drive for billions of miles before you had collected enough data to show that it was that good.
Sure.
Mike?
Yeah, just a small build, Director General. Oh, thanks always for the hard questions. I guess just sort of building on that, it does sort of depend on sort of what was going on in an accident, right? So if it was in fact the AI or the company that wasn't keeping people safe enough, then sure, the responsibility could fall there. But then you could look at things like if the wheel fell off because the maintenance wasn't correct, you'd identify that person who was responsible for the maintenance would be the person that should be accountable. I think what we're seeing around the region, around the world, is really that regulators are starting to develop their standards for testing, and you can see a lot of jurisdictions that are saying, here's what our path to commercialization will look like. You need to be able to demonstrate you've got a certain number of hours of demonstrating that whatever the safety threshold that we set, whether it's 10 times or something different, that has to be set, and we have to have confidence as the regulator that it's happening. We need to understand what's going on with the technology. Then we want to see commercialization, but with a human at the wheel, and it gives the regulator the confidence over time to adopt the technology. The one other thing I'd say that we're seeing is quite interesting is the way that the commercialization is happening. Is it's not perhaps what we would have assumed 20 years ago when everybody was imagining self-driving cars, but it really is that the use case of self-driving cars will be more specific and limited to particular types of routes. And so a platform like ours, where we work with Waymo and Cruise and any of the major autonomous vehicle companies, what we'll say is the routes that are really complicated, we'll probably leave those to humans. And the routes that are maybe a little bit more straightforward, well, those ones we can go to the autonomous car. So something from airport to hotel, that's probably pretty easy for an autonomous vehicle. Nighttime in the rain through small alleys, probably better for the human driver that's got lots more of experience doing it.
Sure. I'd like to get one more question. So anybody? Sure.
Hello, I'm Yeonjin, a senior at Korea University. First of all, thank you for your great speech. And I want to ask some short question. I want to hear your opinions about whether we can acknowledge AI's art as creative output and regard the AI as artist. I want to hear your opinions.
Thank you. Thank you for great questions. Maybe Matthew or Justin, you would like to start?
Sure. Well, one of the, as you might know, one of the artworks that was generated by AI won some art contest. And I personally think that AI art can be creative. There are a lot of debates about whether it's just sampling, kind of putting different things together. But I think Stuart mentioned the case of AlphaGo. There was this move that was sort of amazing, that was sort of incredible, that humans would never, have thought to make that move. And now it's been studied. It's opened up new areas of study for humans. And I think in the same way, AI art can sort of maybe explore certain spaces that we've never thought of, and in that way, at least point towards something that's creative, and we can debate about whether that's creative itself or not.
Justin?
Yeah, I think this goes back to the question also of copyright, and that is part of those debates and those discussions, right? Like, can an AI be a creator, like under our regimes? And I think, to echo Matthew's point, it really depends on what we consider to be creativity. If AI is able to create pieces of art that we can't tell has been made by an AI or a human, is that the threshold for creativity? Is able to win, contests, is that the threshold? Or, do we actually want to have, another threshold, which is kind of the underlying human emotions and thoughts and expression, behind that. And, in the copyright space, an example that we do have in terms of photography was someone at some point tried to register copyright on a piece of photography that was taken by a monkey, right? The monkey just kind of took the picture. And then the copyright offices said, well, no, you can't copyright that because there's no kind of human expression behind. And so with AI, is AI closer to the human creator here taking a picture, or closer to the monkey, right? I think that's part of the question.
So in the coming future, can AI have intellectual property rights?
I hate to be the lawyer, but we don't know,
Right.
And
I forgot the answer, right?
But the IP question is really interesting because it's both at the input level, kind of like copyright infringement on the data that's used to train these models, but also at the output level. And there's a lot of action in that space as well. And there's people that are trying to register copyright and even patents as well. We didn't talk about patents, but on works that I've been creating using AI. So far, copyright offices around the world are not too keen on that, but we'll have to see.
Thank you. I'd like to give Stuart for just closing remark, wrap-up remark for 1 minute, if you have.
Well, so if this impending, and I won't say how soon it's impending, but this impending transition to a world where we are joined by superhuman entities, if that's the biggest event in human history, then it seems that everyone should be involved in decisions about whether and how this happens. At the moment, the ones making the decisions are the CEOs of the companies. And I think they have a vested interest in this question. A couple of them have said that there's a significant chance, 10 or 25% chance of human extinction. So they are deciding to play Russian roulette with the entire human race without our permission. I would not let someone come into my house and play Russian roulette with one of my children. Would you? So why are we letting them do this with every single human being who's alive? That's my closing thought.
Okay, thank you. I think we have discussed that, one of the most, complex issues in our current society. So thank you so much for your participation and sharing your insights, and also the huge thanks to your participation and then your comments and questions. Thank you very much. Thank you.